still got we still got people popping on, but I think because we're going to get I think we're going to get a lot of questions, and we're going to want to leave some time for some discussion at the end of this hour. I think we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So welcome everybody. My name is Mike Gable, even though that's not the name that it says under the bottom of my picture. I am the executive director of Construction Junction, which is a reuse retail operation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But more importantly for this meeting, I am the vice president of the board of directors of Build Reuse. And the board has organized this webinar because we are interested as Build Reuse in exploring submitting for grant funding for the EPA's reducing embodied greenhouse gas emissions for construction materials and products. None of these things are short to say, but in essence, this is basically to develop EPDs, environmental product declarations, that will be funded with a $100 million grant opportunity to label products low carbon to help reduce embodied carbon emissions. And the EPA has listed salvaged building materials as a priority for our industry, potential funding to develop EPDs for salvaged materials. This is an exciting opportunity. It may not be exactly the opportunity that a lot of folks who run building material operations are looking at, where we're looking at labor and storage and things like that. But I think there's some real opportunities here. So we really decided that we wanted to create a webinar that would first go through and really describe to folks the EPDs, the LCAs, sort of that alphabet of labeling products. And we have Luna Oyiwa here, and she is a material analyst for Brightworks Sustainability. And she is going to kind of take us through how these things work, EPDs and LCAs, so that we can have everybody get a little bit better understanding. For me, these are a little confusing for me, so I always have to go back and review, and I appreciate people like Luna who look at these things for a living. And then we also have Brad Guy, who I think has been in this industry longer than anyone else that I know. I've been in it for 25 years. He's been in it longer than I have. He is also follows these things very closely, and has done a lot of work in the green building industry. He's done a lot of stuff in labeling, done deconstruction, advised on setting up reuse operations. So Brad is going to kind of take the second half of this webinar and really talk about how do we apply these labels and how do we use these labels to really create a larger marketplace for our materials. I'm going to ask people to hold questions to the end or put them in the chat. Also, at the end of the webinar, there will be a very, very brief questionnaire that will pop up in your browser. Answer that and get it back to us, because another one of the goals of this meeting is, in order to really go after this EPA funding, we are going to need to partner with a lot of different reuse operations to get the data that we need. And I think this is going to become clear at the end of both of our speakers' presentations. So thanks everybody for showing up, and I'm going to pass it over to Luna.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen, get started. Okay, so as Mike said, I am a materials analyst at Brightworks. My name is Luna Oiwa. I am also a Builders board member and chair of the Data and Policy Committee. In my day job, I do embodied carbon consulting and whole building LCA work, and today I will be walking you through the basics of embodied carbon and related topics. And these are things like LCAs, EPDs, PCRs, other concepts you may be hearing about more and more. And my hope is to provide an overview to help you understand the more technical information that's presented by Brad in the second half of the session, and also to help you better understand and engage in conversations about grant opportunities, policy changes, et cetera, that speak the language of embodied carbon. So first things first, a definition of embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is essentially the emissions that are associated with building materials, from manufacturing to transportation to installation, maintenance, and disposal. As we know, building materials don't come from thin air. They are sourced from somewhere on the earth and processed. And every step of the way requires energy and results in some amount of emissions. The amount of emissions, the magnitude of this depends greatly depending on the type of material. And there's this question of how much does embodied carbon matter? And it's good to take a step back and look at this. Estimates range from 10 to 20% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to embodied carbon. If you look at this graph here, the red portion represents embodied carbon and points to the fact that this is mostly coming from concrete, steel, and aluminum, both because they are carbon-intensive materials to produce and also because they're used in such large quantities across the building sector. And the dark gray portion says in small font, including building finishes, equipment, glass, etc. And some, but not all of that gray portion of the pie is also embodied carbon. So in conclusion, embodied carbon is a very significant amount of this total global greenhouse gas emissions. And what's more, embodied carbon is also considered an upfront carbon. And what that means is that these emissions arise at the very beginning of a building's lifespan. Whereas building energy usage, that's also associated with emissions, and the emissions that are tied with building energy use accumulates over the course of the building's lifespan. The embodied carbon, in contrast, is all coming at the very beginning of the project, when these materials are being manufactured and transported and so on. And because of the time-sensitive nature of the climate crisis, it's really important to start reducing this embodied carbon as soon as possible. I wanted to go over some of the units that are used to measure embodied carbon. GWP is global warming potential, and kilogram carbon equivalents is another term that's used. And these terms are used to describe the effects of different greenhouse gas emissions in one metric by using carbon dioxide as a reference. The graph on the right shows that methane is about 25 times more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere, other gases more. So again, to reiterate, some greenhouse gas emissions trap heat more than others. And to be able to compare these effects, we all describe them all relative to carbon dioxide. LCA stands for Life Cycle Assessment, and it is the study of inputs and outputs for a given material. LCAs are studied over a certain time frame, typically about 60 years, which is the standard that was set by the LEED certification. And LCAs are broken down into different stages. So at the top here, you can see the product stage, construction stage, maintenance and use, end of life, and beyond the life cycle. And these product stages are further subcategorized into different modules. So you see on the bottom, A1, A2, A3, etc. Now the product stage, or A1 to A3 emissions, tend to be make up the highest proportion of the total emissions for most materials. But there are exceptions to this. For example, if a material is replaced multiple times over the course of a building's life, then that's captured in the maintenance and use phase. And that's effectively multiplying the A1 to A3 emissions by the number of replacements in that 60 years or however many years are being studied. You may have heard the terms cradle to gate and cradle to grave and cradle to cradle, and these are all referring to the boundaries of the study in terms of these life cycle stages. And the next topic I wanted to cover was environmental product declarations. So these are simply reports that are summarizing a given building material or product's LCA. Not all building materials or products have environmental product declarations, and it's up to the manufacturer to decide whether to invest the time and effort in data collection and to cover any relevant fees and to create these EPDs for their products. EPD availability, because of this, depends on the material. Certain materials, there are more EPDs than others at this time, and also the region of the globe. So I think for the most part, North America has a lot of EPDs, Europe has a lot of EPDs, but not so much other areas. I also want to note that having an EPD does not indicate that a particular product is low carbon, although products with EPDs generally tend to be lower carbon since this transparency in data incentivizes low carbon practices. The goal of the EPD is to provide transparency. So you can find EPDs in free online EPD databases or on manufacturers' websites and other places. And from the perspective of construction project procurement teams, EPDs are relevant because certifications like LEED ask for EPDs. So a lot of times when projects are pursuing the LEED certification, they go out and try to procure products with EPDs specifically. And companies looking to meet sustainability targets might also use EPDs to choose one product over the other due to its carbon intensity. And from the perspective of manufacturers, it helps differentiate products from the rest of the market by bringing awareness to the emissions that are in the products that they're producing. And it also provides an opportunity for manufacturers to really study room for efficiencies, steps that can be done with lower emission manufacturing processes, for example. And lastly, with EPDs, EPDs can be product specific or industry wide. And what product specific means is that the EPD is LCA that was conducted for a specific product and a specific product line, whereas an industry-wide EPD is more representative of a given product type, with data compiled from multiple manufacturers and combined to form an industry average. And next, I really briefly want to go over some key information that's listed in EPDs. One, there's the functional unit, where the EPD notes. So the EPD reports carbon metrics, and the functional unit tells you the unit of material that those carbon metrics are being applied to. So later on in the EPD, you'll see the GWP values for certain modules in the life cycle analysis, and the functional unit tells you whether that's carbon data for 1 cubic meter of that material or 1 kilogram, etc. And this page of the EPD, in addition to that functional unit, tells you the intended application and use of the product, the assumed lifespan of the product, whether the product is meant to be used in commercial or residential projects, the date that the EPD was issued, how long the EPD is valid for, whether it is a product-specific or industry-wide EPD, whether the life cycle stages that were covered are covering the cradle to grave stages, etc., what year the data collection took place, and what LCA software or database was used, the LCA methodology, and whether it was a third-party verified EPD. So a lot of information, but it's essentially just background information on the life cycle analysis that was conducted to keep track of all the assumptions. And then one more thing that I skipped but wanted to draw attention to is the PCR piece. PCRs are product category rules, and they are guidelines on what data to gather and how it's evaluated in the LCA. And PCRs differ by product type. So for example, on the slide, you'll see the PCR listed is for non-metal ceiling panels and wall panel systems. So this LCA was conducted following guidelines for that specific product type. And this is really important because it's important to ensure that EPDs for comparable materials are comparable. And continuing to scroll through the pages of the EPD, you'll find the actual carbon data that I was referring to earlier. This is a screenshot of a table that shows this. In the top row, you'll see GWP, kilogram carbon equivalents as a unit. And then again, the breakdown of the carbon data by the modules, A1 to A3, A4 to A5, and so on. And then also a reminder of the functional unit, which you might see at the top corner there of that table. And as I pointed out earlier, even with this Armstrong ceiling tile example, the A1 to A3 emissions, which are the manufacturing emissions, are significantly higher than the other modules. Note that embodied carbon is not the only environmental impact indicator that's studied in LCAs. You'll see, in addition to GWP, you'll see ozone depletion potential, acidification potential, and a couple others. Next, talking about the concept of whole building LCAs. So a whole building LCA is an aggregation of LCAs for all the major building materials in a given building. And I say major because it's not practical to try to collect information for every single building product. There's a trade-off between the time spent doing that and the value of this information. But yeah, so it's essentially a way to estimate the total carbon of a building. And in bigger construction projects, the architectural and structural teams typically already have a 3D model of the building in a software like Revit. And they hand this file off to the whole building LCA modeler, who pulls the quantities directly from the Revit model. And in other cases, the general contractor provides the whole building LCA modeler with quantities in Excel. So that's how quantities are collected. And then what the whole building LCA modeler then does is map these quantities to carbon data from EPDs to estimate this total embodied carbon of the building. And there can be a lot of uncertainties in the quantities collected and in the carbon data, but again, the goal here is to get a good enough estimate to use this information for decision making in design and also in procurement. So that was a lot of information, and I kind of want to take a second to recap these terms. So embodied carbon, again, is the emissions that are coming from creating and using building materials. GWP is a unit of measuring embodied carbon. LCA is an embodied carbon study for a given building material. PCRs are material-specific guidance on how to conduct an LCA, and an EPD is an LCA report. And whole building lifecycle analyses, or whole WB LCAs, are summaries of LCAs for all the major building materials in a given building. And now tying this all back to reuse, the reason this is important to understand is because there are policies, grants, and other opportunities out there now more than ever that are striving to reduce embodied carbon. And for a long time, green building was focused on reducing emissions that are coming from building operations and energy use. And there's a lot of work to be done in that realm too, but there's a lot of attention now being put on embodied carbon. And the way that big entities like the government think of it, you can't improve what you can't measure. And so there's a lot of emphasis being put on metrics like this. And if you want to capitalize on these opportunities as a member of the building material reuse community, it's important to have some understanding of how this measuring is taking place and to be able to speak this language. Want to note that there are already ways to account for reuse in whole building LCAs. One popular method is to zero out the A1 to A3, again, the manufacturing emissions for a reused material, since that reused material is kind of taking the place of a new material that would have otherwise been purchased. However, there is no one standardized way of accounting for reuse yet in a whole building LCA. And there have been a lot of questions that have come up with this. An example is a coworker of mine recently brought up that suppose there's a big tech company and they buy new furniture and store it temporarily in a partnering warehouse or some other entity that is technically different from them, like has a different name or something like that. And then they transfer those still pretty much brand new furniture pieces to their offices and call that reuse. To prevent something like this, we would need to come up with a formal definition of what a reuse material is. There's that, and in general, there's a lack of emissions data tied to deconstruction, regrading, and other processes that are associated with reuse. And we intuitively know that the emissions of these processes are very low compared to manufacturing new, but they are non-zero. So this is, I guess the recently released EPA EPD grant opportunity that Mike was referring to earlier, I think is an opportunity to study these things. We all know that reuse lowers environmental impact, but there is value to putting a credible number to it. And that way we can really highlight the difference that reuse makes in the midst of all these embodied carbon conversations. So at least the way I view it, it's not just about EPDs, it's more broadly about carbon accounting. And if the reuse community speaks the language of embodied carbon, we're able to better partner with large groups like the government and corporations, receive funding and support, and scale up the work that's currently being done. There's a lot of momentum going on right now, and it would be great to be able to ride that momentum. And I just have a few slides here. I know it's a lot of text, but to hammer home why it's important to speak the language of embodied carbon, there's LEED, there's the embodied carbon policies in certain regions of the US, and there's also a lot of federal funding supporting embodied carbon reduction right now. I'm not going to go through all these, but here is a list of federal initiatives, together totaling hundreds of billions of dollars, or not hundreds of billions, billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, supporting embodied carbon reduction. And this is the section of the Inflation Reduction Act that Mike was referring to earlier. Under that section of the IRA is the Reducing Embodied Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Construction Materials and Products grant. Very recently released, $100 million in grants and cooperative agreements. The application deadline is January 8th. It touches on the concepts that I just talked about, EPDs, PCRs, and yeah, more information to come. I know Sean Wood had a webinar about it, specifically tailored towards the building material reuse community on October 16th. And I believe that webinar recording is available online. And there are also a couple upcoming EPA webinars about that. Builder Use is looking for partners. And like Mike said, please let us know if you're interested in partnering. I think that is it for my section. Thanks all for listening. And I'll pass it on to Brad.
I mute myself. So thanks, Luna. That was excellent. And I'm glad I didn't have to do that part. So I'm doing a little more aspects of how this might be beneficial to the industry and feeding into some of these systems. So I have three parts to this. A little more about EPDs, then how the reuse community might benefit more broadly, even than just the technical aspects of LCAs and EPDs. And then I have some examples. So as Mike mentioned, I've been around. So this is some examples of efforts I've been part of. Reuse has had its own world, and really, I would say the big picture is to get a bigger seat at the bigger table, if I can only say it in one way. And so that table is related to green building, construction waste, architecture and engineering community, the carbon market, so to speak, those who value carbon, standards development, which is pretty much how the world operates in construction. So speaking of definitions, I think Luna's correct. This is really important for the industry really being able to define and carve that out for itself. But in fact, EPA has provided some definitions in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So just to point out that in this case, salvage and reuse do not refer to recycled content or surplus materials. So, and I know Sean Wood's on this call, and he may not be able to answer this question, but this is actually EPA starting to define what we're talking about. And this deconstruction, I think we all generally agree, methods may be different, but the goal is to maximize for reuse. Recycling, energy recovery, waste disposal are secondary goals in these processes. Report just issued last month, actually, by the U.S. Green Building Council and the Rocky Mountain Institute. So literally their sort of policy roadmap, so on, top design interventions for embodied carbon reduction. Reuse is actually at the top. So I don't think we have to really keep debating this. What I think the industry has to do is answer the call. Clearly adaptive reuse and relocation of an existing building, I hope we would all agree is preferable to any kind of dismantling or sort of piecemeal reuse, but nonetheless, it is a cycle, and you'll see that another prime strategy is circular design. So also looking at future reusability, recyclability, design for deconstruction. Lina mentioned the top, what are called tier 1 priorities for EPA's embodied carbon. So just to actually write that out. Salvage material is a category. You see that the other tier 1 products are, in fact, products or specific types of materials. And my arrows there are to, at least as we all know, illustrate the point that for reuse, it is literally anything that can be used. So there are certainly obstacles to the reuse of, say, cast in place concrete. But if you, for example, were to take that, grind it into an aggregate product, and before it reaches its functional stage, that could be considered a reclaimed aggregate. Steel in the UK is being reused and standards developed for that. Glass as a piece of glass or within a window unit still is glass. And then in the tier 2 products, so this is over time, EPA is looking at next stage products. So many of these, of course, would have more or less difficulties for actual uses, we know it. But I think it's important to keep in mind when we say salvage as a process, and then it applies to, again, almost any product that we can think of. And as Luna mentioned, an environmental product declaration, I would say it's the tip of the iceberg. One can do an LCA, life cycle analysis, and you do not have to produce an EPD. The EPD is really just a way to communicate to sort of the dumb architect like me, for example, who would not have to read the 30 or 40 page LCA report. There's still a lot of ambiguities or difficulties, as Luna alluded to, around what we call harmonization and alignment. But the goal is we want to make science-based data more readily available across the whole sector of the construction industry, whether you are a toxicologist or a building scientist, all the way to the contractor or the subcontractor. And the goal is transparency. It is not to say what you should buy per se. EPA has another, I believe, $100 or $150 million coming for what they're trying to do as a national carbon labeling program. And this is one phase in that effort. So a point I think I'm gonna reference in the next couple of slides is this is a long-term idea. This is about carbon and greenhouse gas and climate change for the rest of our lives. This is not even the 5-year period of this grant. The federal government has goals of net zero carbon emissions from the US economy by 2050. Will they achieve those goals? Who knows? But those targets have been set. And EPDs are just one piece of that. And I'm just going to reference here back to what this is all about in terms of international references and standards, working with different parts of the industry, defining PCRs, product category rules, and just a simple graphic. This is in the UK from 2011 to 2020. So we all know things really slowed down in the period of COVID, but this is not going away. This is like, I don't know, recycled content. I like to use the example. 30 years ago, it would have been just a really odd thing, but it's hard to find products, many products without recycled content in the current day, because as industry and government incentives go, the world follows, the private interest, the private consumer, the economies and efficiencies to do these things all increase. Are in fact EPDs for reuse and reusable products. So this is not unknown. These are all in Europe, unfortunately, because they've just been ahead of the US in their interest in carbon legislation, carbon concerns. Obviously, they have constraints for landfill. They have legislation around product disassembly and take back. They just really are good examples of where we might be, or we could hope we'll be in 5 to 10 years. And so we can always look to a lot of these examples that have already been developed and how to follow those. This is my sort of picture of why you should do this in a general way. Even if you don't care about the built environment greenhouse gas reduction, you might care about the growth of the reuse industry. What is required to create LCAs and EPDs are components of knowledge, information, training, education, mapping, tracing, communication, digital skills, so on and so forth. And I would say, by the way, those feed back to or are integral to helping the industry grow, no matter what you care about, so to speak, if you still care about just growing the market for reused products. So just for example, training for technology. So yeah, you might be trained or learn more about databasing or things like that for an LCA. But by the way, databasing is actually part of inventorying, e-commerce. business-to-business transactions, and so on. This isn't just the federal government, this is local governments, this is the private markets. There are investments coming from IRA, as Lena mentioned, for green banks. So these are just going to be private financing instruments for businesses. And a huge one of those is the building industry. And low carbon building products will be fundable under this private sector financing for single family, multifamily, and commercial buildings. So this is not just for commercial or the federal government interest. So this is my top 10, although I didn't number them. I didn't want to give a sense they are ranked, but I think the reason why the reuse industry should participate is if the reuse community doesn't define what this is all about, then others will. We can only look to the Environmental Purchasing Program, Department of Energy programs for me to say, well, who doesn't have an Energy Star appliance or a WaterSense appliance or a Green Seal product, or go to the grocery store and look at some of your cleaning products and the labels that are available. That all came because of this actual office, which is funding this program, which is the Office of Environmentally Profitable Purchasing. All these increasing means to incentivize reuse require information. It's just that simple. If you can't quantify it, if somebody wants to invest in it through a climate action plan, a local community, or any other way, it's just a lot of hand waving. And we want to legitimize reuse. So to include it within the overall systems, which architecture, engineering, and construction community use. And so I'm an architect. I use ASTM, I use UL, and any building code or LEED or anywhere you look relies on standards. It's just that simple, that we want to make these sort of understood, agreed upon, legitimate methods available. So I don't have to go out and do some kind of stress test every product that I specify, as long as I know that it meets an ASTM standard. There are other components to this grant opportunity, including creating quality standards. So if you read the fine print, EPA is also interested in these functional units. So how long does something last when it's reclaimed? Is it structural or comparable, or what needs to be done to make it comparable? So there's way more to this than just simply saying it's creating an EPD. So I think and I can't speak for builder use, but the opportunities and participation, quote, is, again, if you don't do it, someone else will, or in fact, it won't be done. So to participate in the standard setting, to participate in creating and becoming the resources for data collection and inventory and systems, and also, again, feeding back to improving inventory and data collection. And again, this is not just the environmental data, it's any and all the data that one would need to operate efficiently. It's to participate at the individual level, or it's an industry-wide level. It's to receive training in digital school skills and inventory skills, environmental assessment. And again, none of these things are irrelevant to operating an efficient business. So I have two examples. Mike alluded to, or may have been in this a while. So actually back in 2006, I was doing LCAs of deconstruction projects. So at that point, I don't know, there were no APDs or there weren't very many. And so we had no real kind of outlet for this, but we certainly knew that we needed to value carbon and greenhouse gas for these processes. So again, I'm trying to put this down at simple levels. It's simply accounting. It's simply counting up inputs and outputs. So for deconstruction, you have things like transport, equipment, fuel. You are going to create waste or impacts of waste. You may transport You may have transport of reuse and recycling. Recycling might go somewhere else, a different process. Reuse may go to direct reuse or reuse store. And then we can start looking at the avoidance of new products. So this is a result where we're actually, in this case, doing a comparative LCA. The negative numbers, which don't really exist in reality, are because we are looking at the avoidance of new production. So in LCA speak, this is the module D effects. And all what we're really saying is balancing out the impacts of making new materials. And so both the carbon, literal carbon numbers, so this is greenhouse gas equivalents in grams per square foot of the actual buildings, but also looking at the processes. So we're very readily identifying that disposal is a huge impact across all the impacts, primarily equipment transport and disposal. Recycling, of course, we'll get some aspect of that. And then, of course, the lion's share of benefit is from the actual salvage of material. In this case, we only netted about 43% recovery rate. So if you see that in the red bar for the total impacts, I was looking at and realizing that we still had an actual impact from the deconstruction, meaning all of our impacts were not negated, quote unquote, by what we avoided by recovering these materials. So in a modeling way, I sort of plugged in numbers until I reached the sweet spot, which was at least a 55% recovery rate, whereby we literally preserved as much carbon as we expended it in this process. So when Luna said, we might say, well, there's a negative or a sort of a zero or negligible passover of a recovered material to reuse. Yeah, it's really low, of course. It's very low compared to a new product, but it may not be non-zero. And the quantification and real sort of basis for that is what gives us credibility. And again, I learned something. The 45% recovery wasn't really efficient. So something like transportation becomes very low. Using mechanical means is just using fuel and diesel fuel, for example, and those are high greenhouse gas impacts. We can make deconstruction carbon neutral, and we can do what's called the module D benefits to be literally that zero kind of impact into the next system. So the second LCA, in this case, more specifically carbon footprint, was of the community forklift in Washington, D.C. So again, we sort of start by mapping this out. What are the inputs and outputs, literally? Because the reuse facility is, and I'm using simple terms here, the equivalent of a factory to produce reclaimed material. And I felt not only because people like Jim Schulman and Nancy Meyer were kind enough to let us have access, but it's a pretty good representation of the sort of variabilities, the operations. So community forklift picks up and drops off, has drop-offs. It sells pretty much any reuse material you could find. It does some recycling and so on. And so what are we saying here? This is about extrapolating and quantifying and multiplying these impacts across the entire United States, elevate total industry. So this is literally, I mean, I am simplifying, but it's not too far off, but the unit process is that production. And so what do we take in? Materials, energy, water. There are other kinds of inputs or losses, such as ecosystem depletion, which is somewhat measurable by materials, but it is a kind of ecological impact. And then we have the production. So the production is unfortunately pollutants like waste or emissions to air like greenhouse gas And of course, what you really want to produce, which is that thing, that actual thing that you produce. So inputs to community forklift were or are, it's building electricity, it's heating, it's on-site equipment, transport. We went a little overboard with employee transport. That's a kind of scope 3 of a scope 3 because it's not controllable by the facility. Waste transport, because they will have waste. And then in this case, we were measuring specifically the greenhouse gas component. And this is just illustrative, so sort of the solution and the problem. At the time, community forklift only had paper receipts, so we had to sit down. And again, I'll thank Jim Schulman for sharing with me boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of utility bills and so on. You know, so this is where, this is 12, 13 years ago. Nowadays, you can get a better digital record. And you'll see the categories down below. So one of the efforts has to be organizing these categories. So another nice thing about community forklift at the time was they also used a clean energy provider, which is called Clean Currents, for wind power. So you can see how the building electricity could actually be zero if you're using clean energy or photovoltaics. And so we have an output of impacts. We have a negative, quote unquote, for the reuse and recycle. So we end up with a very similar chart to the previous example. And again, ironically or interestingly enough, a big part of the impacts was the waste to landfill. And then in this case, transportation to do pickups. And you can see the negative quote, so that is the actual reuse benefit. So the reason I did this back in 2011 was because I thought, well, local communities may want to invest in greenhouse gas reduction activities within their communities. And so why not elevate reuse as a locally fundable greenhouse gas reduction program? You're going to invest in building rehabilitations, renewable energy, EVs, multimodal transportation. All of these reduce greenhouse gases. And by the way, reuse does as well. So all of the things in a community that you might think about in a comprehensive strategy, reuse has a very important part to play. Not to mention all the known benefits of building community, supporting disadvantaged communities, and so on. So these were some of the issues we came to find, which again, that was a while ago. I know everybody's improving in all of these aspects, but they hint to, again, back to the beginning, how and why this EPD effort and funding can do a lot more than you might think. And where we look at literal operational improvements, in this case, well, if you have electrification instead of natural gas, you're going to be able to go to renewable energy. If you reduce waste, so why? Why would you have waste at a reuse center? Improving pickup logistics, or even just illustrating just to a funder or a grantor the value of a zero partial emissions vehicles for your operation. So thanks very much. I hope we did okay on the time. I know maybe cutting it long, but we'll have some questions and I'm happy to answer further. Thanks, Mike.
All right. Thank you, Brad. That was a lot of information to go through. Hold on just a second here.
And do I need to stop?
Yeah, can you exit from your screen there, Brad, and
so
hopefully.
And it's probably more, oh, there it is. I got it. Thank you.
Whoops. Oh, and I just hit the wrong button on my screen, so. There we go. All right, so we actually have a decent amount of questions in the chat. We're gonna save all these and make them available. So I think what I'll do here in the last few minutes, did anybody want to ask a direct question to Brad and Luna that you didn't ask in the chat? I think some of the questions that were asked in the chat were answered by Luna. Some were answered by some of our I think some of our folks from EPA. So I will just open it up. If somebody, you can just go off of mute, and if you have an additional question that you would like to ask.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Rob Sommerfeld, National Center for Craftsmanship. One of the things we do is educate students through construction by deconstructing buildings. And, you know, I've tried to wade through some of the EPA materials, trying to make heads or tails of where we fit into that. And I mean, just to give you an idea, the last jobs we worked on, there were 4 buildings in a row. We had a diversion rate of 81.77%. And that was recycled 298.91 tons, reused to repurposed 131.17 tons. So we hit 430 tons reused, recycled. How does the EPA look at that? What are, you know, I guess it comes down to, what are they looking for? Are they looking for that kind of data?
Brad, you might be able to
Yeah.
answer this better since you have taken a closer look at the
Sure.
EPA grants.
So, Robert, that's a huge piece of the data. The data for an LCA is going to be, in addition, those outputs. So you're going to have the inputs. And if you used a lot of human labor, good for you in a good way, because there's no carbon accounting for human labor. Even though we breathe carbon dioxide, we don't get it counted in LCA. So you're going to be measuring, in addition to those outputs, the inputs, and categorizing, and this is a deeper conversation, but categorizing that method relative to, for example, the building type, and it might be like on a per square foot basis. So, you know, someone could say, well, okay, that's using that method that Robert uses. I now have a data point, which is we could expect to produce. And if we get you and doing 4 of those, now we have a range of data, right? And we would have a min and a max and a medium. And so then we have actual real kind of data that's usable for someone to say in a EPD, LCA, and in projections, this is what the deconstruction process will do. And that translates into a procurement, credit for, you know, funding dollars. It's all the things that would come from the quote proof of what you did, again, in a rigorous and comprehensive way. Using the sort of not you or me, like how I did mine, was actually using the ISO standards. And so you would have to use the ISO standards as kind of the simple way to say it. But so does that make sense? There's benefit to you being able to claim that, but there's a benefit to you being able to say, I can do it again. This sort of thing.
Right. Okay, so to keep track of transportation of, say, employees or the crew, and then material hauling by subcontractors to haul 30-yard dumpsters off, and use of a telehandler forklift, and then heavy equipment to tear out and recycle the concrete. Okay, I think I follow now. Okay, thank you.
But then, Brad, so the practical application, if we're going to kind of take this to the next level, which is if we're going to come up with an EPD or a low carbon label for the material that's just been deconstructed so it can be put out into the marketplace as a certified low carbon material, that's part of, I think, what we're, as Build Reuse and as our partners, that we're looking for to collect this data, but also come up with a process for practical purposes for an organization like Build Reuse to be that independent third-party verifier of what people are claiming their low carbon operations are producing. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so the PCR, which is what are the rules, what I just told Robert, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it, as far as collecting information. If you do things like templates, so I think you'd want to be able to say, we're going to train people in collecting the data. Here's an app or a template, for example, so you want to streamline all of this. You need to be able to report it somewhere, right? So you want to you say, well, I'm going to host this data. The verification of the data, there's many ways to do that. And then you're going to produce, as an operator, if you choose to be one, you're going to be the producer of that EPD, which is, again, just the summary of the LCA, which is a much more detailed background. And so, and I hope I can say this in plain English, because it's not easy to say in plain English, but the impacts that Robert incurs in recovering that material are going to be, in effect, an impact carried over into the next, quote, product system. If his impacts, whatever his impacts are going to be subtracted from production of a new material. So that's where you get kind of this benefit. So if his impacts turn out to be 5% of making the new equivalent material, then he's going to carry over a benefit of 95% lower carbon for that product. The next stage is going to be the actual use center or whoever, takes that material and what they need to do. So if it's a B2B or directly to a project site with absolute most minimal processing, then you're still retaining as much carbon as possible. If you went into a remanufacturing or you had to store it in your highly heated building for a long time, that is accruing sort of a negative, if you know what I mean. Those are more impacts to doing that. So I hope that all makes sense. And I know it's not easy to understand, but this is a system. It's a system of recovering and then reusing. And again, what many people are interested in also is, can I now make a claim that my product will be reusable in the future, which is another batch of interest from EPA. Does that make sense, Robert?
Yeah, thank you.
I mean,
and yes, it can be confusing.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think that's a good, I think a good illustration of one of the reasons why we Build Reuse wanted to have this particular webinar and this call was just to create a way that people could understand operationally what this looks like, what's missing, and what role an organization like Build Reuse, doesn't have to be Build Reuse. I think the board of Build Reuse would like it to be, but we're still exploring how we would put this grant together. We, clearly from all of the data necessary to really capture how our industry works and how we add and how we might come up with a low carbon label, we're going to need to collect a lot of data. So we're going to need to have, partners that are actually doing physical work like Robert on the ground and other reuse operations that are willing to do what Community Forklift did, and really, help us start to collect and amass this data so we can start to develop this process to come up with a low carbon label for our materials. Yeah, and it is really hard to get your head around. So it's 5:04. Thanks everybody for hanging on, and I'm sure that there are a ton more questions and probably people on this call that have knowledge that myself and our two presenters may have some contributions to this discussion. You will come up in your browser there. We asked 3 really basic questions about, are you interested in participating or being a partner in this grant with Build Reuse? We asked what kind of operator you are. But in addition to that, I would say, if you have some other more specific contributions or ideas that you would like to share with Build Reuse, please just shoot us an email at info@buildreuse.org. And we will be diligently looking for your suggestions, your contributions, your ideas, and your interest in partnering. And based on the kind of questions we get, and we'll probably end up doing some follow-ups in our newsletter. We may end up putting together even another kind of webinar or some other maybe larger meeting discussions. Again, thanks everybody for hanging on and the interest in this topic. And I think this is a great opportunity. I think we're gonna have to all do a lot of heavy lifting, and but that defines our industry, heavy lifting. So I think we're up for the task. Thanks again, everybody, and we will follow up with everybody that reaches out to us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
It'll come up on my browser, eh?
Mike, make sure to save the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Luna. I just remembered to do that right before you said it. So
thanks, Luna. I was just typing a text to him.
Is it showing? Is the